My name is Mike Hoffman. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Business Ethics here at your college. And if you are visitors to the college, welcome. I want to welcome you to the third Raytheon Business Ethics Lectureship Series. We had, as you know, 10 senior executive lecturers under Sears Roebuck sponsorship prior to Raytheon becoming our sponsor over the last year and a half. And we're delighted today to be having as our Raytheon lecturer Jamie Gorelick, and she will be introduced by someone who I will be introducing in just a moment. I want to, before I forget it, which I sometimes have done, to remind you that that this lecture is going to be filmed, and as a part of the Bentley's partnership with WGBH, this lecture is being filmed, and you will be able to watch it on the web if you wanted to, if you're working on some paper or some course that you need to review whatever Ms. Gorelick says today. You'll be able to watch it by going to wgbh.org/forum, and you'll find it in the business and economics section of that website. I also want to invite you to come up and enjoy conversation with Ms. Gorelick up in the Commons, where we'll have food and drink and dialogue. And all of you who are here today are to come up, if you can, at 5 o'clock right after the lecture and enjoy that. It may even be a little before 5. I also know that some of you have to make another class sometime close to 5 o'clock. So if you have to leave, please do so quietly, but we'll totally understand that you have another commitment with regard to that. We will be having questions and answers after Mrs. Gorelick's talk, and I'll be facilitating that Q&A, and then after the Q&A, we will have the reception. It's my pleasure to introduce Pat Nazo, who I've known for quite some time in the business ethics field. Pat is the Vice President of Business Practices at United Technologies Corporation, and he drove up today from Hartford in order to introduce Ms. Gorelick. And Pat has been in that position for over a decade now. Sorry, Pat, I knew you probably didn't want me to say all of that about age, but I am in the same position. He's responsible for the corporation's compliance and ethics program, which includes managing more than 260 business practice officers all over the world. These officers are responsible for supporting management's implementation of the company's ethics and compliance program for all of its 200 and some odd thousand employees in more than 180 countries. And we thought that given today's emphasis upon corporate governance, what better way to have a contribution to this lectureship series than having an independent board member of a major Fortune 50 corporation like UTC, which Ms. Gorelick is on the board of directors at UTC. So, Pat, thank you for coming up to introduce Ms. Gorelick, and come on up now, if you will. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
We may be of the same vintage, but I'm better looking.
Absolutely. Go for it.
It's a real pleasure to be here to introduce Jamie to you. You've seen her bio. It's extensive, obviously. She's at Wilmer Pickering now as a lawyer, but she's been with Fannie Mae as its vice chairman, deputy attorney general. Missing in the bio was that she was general counsel of the Department of Defense in addition to the 9/11 Commission. But what I'm going to talk to you about just for a minute is my experience with Jamie with respect to her membership on our board. I sit at the audit committee of the board of directors for UTC, and I've been doing that for a decade or so. And I give presentations to the audit committee on a required basis twice a year, and I sit there for everything else. You'll find that if you understand anything about what's going on with respect to Sarbanes-Oxley and business and ethics, the idea of activist board members is new with respect to many corporations. Individuals who actually ask questions, demand answers, and expect that corporations are going to do the kinds of things that they tout that they do on their websites with respect to their programs. This is new for many board members, but it's not new for either UTC or for Jamie in her position on the audit committee. I'm fortunate that I've had people on our audit committee who have been chairmen like Howard Baker, who set the tone for our audit committee, and it was an activist audit committee and still is today, meaning that I'm expected to come in with answers. I'm expected to explain how the program is working. I'm expected to tell them about where all the problems are and how we're going to be resolving those problems. Nothing can be hidden with respect to how we manage the audit committee, and Jamie is an integral part of that. So without further ado, and because it is an honor to be able to introduce someone to you who actually cares about what's happening with respect to corporate America and has been intimately involved in that. And if you take a look at her background with respect to Fannie Mae and what she did in the area of social responsibility, Fannie Mae is up there as an organization that has been more socially responsible with respect to things like daycare centers and women in positions, higher level positions within Fannie Mae than most corporations in this country. It's a real honor to introduce to you Jamie Gorelick.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you all of you for having me here today. As Pat indicated, I've led a fairly varied professional life, and I'm happy to engage with you in the questions and answers on any issue from my tenure at Fannie Mae to the 9/11 Commission to the Department of Justice or anything else. But I would like to take this opportunity, because this is such a prestigious lectureship, because Bentley College has taken the time and effort to try to bring together over the past decade or so a stellar group of people to talk about business ethics. I would like to take the opportunity to, in a set piece, address the thoughts that I've collected on the role of the board in ethical oversight. And I was delighted to have been asked to make these remarks, and I come to this topic of the board's role as the keeper of the corporate conscience, if you will, from two perspectives. First, I'm a lawyer in a law firm, Wilmer, Cutler, Pickering, Hale and Dorr, that has done many of the internal investigations for boards whose companies like Enron, like MCI, have experienced problems in the last 5 years. And as Pat said, we do a tremendous amount of work in the area of corporate governance and efforts to implement the laws and the regulations that emanated from those scandals. Second, I'm a director of two fabulous companies, United Technologies and Schlumberger J, that live in and thrive in this post-Enron environment. And so for both of these reasons, the subject of the board's role in corporate ethics is one that interests me a great deal, and I'm very glad to know that it interests you. So let me start off this way. First, let me say that the title of this speech should really end in a question mark. Why? Because in the first instance, the keeper of the corporate conscience is management. So while it is true that the board is the ultimate backstop, the ethics and the values of a company, to quote Michael Rutgers, who gave this lecture last year as the chairman of EMC, quote, flow from the commitment, action, and credibility of its leaders. So before discussing the board's special role in ensuring the ethical conduct of corporate life, I want to lay a predicate for that role, which of course is in the actions of senior corporate leaders in promoting ethical behavior. Now, we all know that most companies in America, and in fact most companies around the world, have codes of conduct. But the employees of ethical companies do not engage in ethical behavior because they've been given a code of conduct. Rather, they are embracing the underlying values in such a code because it is part of a culture that surrounds them. So how do they discern that culture? As the chairman of Raytheon, William Swanson, said in introducing his company's sponsorship of this lecture, ethical leaders lead by example. They create a culture of collegiality, of honesty, of curiosity, so that issues are raised in a forthright way without fear of retribution, without fear of ostracism. To make sure that they have the culture that they think they have, these companies survey their employees to find out their views and, importantly, their perceptions of the ethics of the company. And that is critical. They, in Swanson's words, beg for the bad news. And they communicate that they are strong enough to take criticisms and to hear concerns. And that is critical also. So ethical leaders are self-confident. They're self-confident enough to want that transparency, to welcome questions, to encourage debate. They know that if they are not ethical, others will not follow them, and they know that if they are ethical, their employees will charge up that hill behind them every day of the week. So codes of conduct are just a starting point for the CEO of an ethical company. My partner, Paul Brontes, who has counseled hundreds of companies in the course of his long career, has written a wonderful book called Boardroom Excellence, and it has a foreword by Senator Paul Sarbanes, who was the co-author of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And Paul writes of the CEO as ethical leader, and this is what he says. While new laws, rules, and regulations may serve as guidelines for the creation of public trust and confidence in the corporation's accounting and disclosure system and compensation practices, the corporation will not earn that trust and confidence unless it is led by a proactive CEO who believes in corporate integrity and ethical behavior, who acts ethically, talks explicitly and repeatedly within the corporation of the need to promote integrity, denounces overreaching, and here is the key here, makes believers of the corporation's officers, employees, customers, suppliers, and advisors. Now, employees know if their company is ethical because they can see it in how they are treated. They can see it in how customers are treated. They can see it in the corporate response to environmental, health, and safety obligations. They see it in corporate investment in the education of employees. They see it in the private decisions that business leaders make. And they'll believe that what is written in the code of ethics is the real code by which the company lives when they see ethical decision-making in action, when customers and business partners are treated honestly, when financial objectives are achieved with due appreciation for the legal, public policy, and ethical standards, when integrity is a core competency reflected in recruiting and promotion, and when the company is honest with itself about its own shortcomings. At United Technologies, our chairman and CEO, George David, has brought a passion to this particular subject. In his public dealings and in his private dealings, he teaches by example, and he has incorporated these commitments into the everyday life of the company. This is not a once-a-year matter. This is the everyday life of the company. And I just want to give you 3 very concrete examples. First, United Technologies has embraced the toughest environmental standards, reducing hazardous waste by 85% since 1990 and air emissions by 95%. That's huge. It has said, and it is on target to achieve dramatic reductions in water and energy consumption. And these commitments are tracked as all of the corporate commitments that the company makes, all of its financial objectives. These commitments are tracked aggressively, and they are reported regularly, and achievements are celebrated. So, the communities in which United Technologies manufactures Otis elevators or Carrier air conditioners or Sikorsky helicopters or Pratt & Whitney engines, they know they can measure for themselves the social responsibility of this company, as can its employees. And this is my second example. Recognizing that job security is really the only real job security is in a good education. Our CEO has led the establishment of an employee scholar program, which is an award-winning commitment to the employees of United Technologies. And for the students here, you can appreciate it. It pays all the tuition of any employee to attend any accredited school and pursue any line of study. And once the student has achieved successful attainment of the degree, the company gives the employee $10,000 in stock. So far, the company is proud that there have been 14,000 degrees awarded. There are another 13,000 employees in school today. And the company has invested a remarkable $400 million in the program to date. Now, I will tell you, that is an eye-popping number. And employees take the measure of this company when they see this program in action. And let me give you the third example. In 1992, well before compliance was a household word, United Technologies established an ombudsman program that welcomes inquiries and responses and comments from employees. There have been 60,000 inquiries since the initiation of this program, and countless of them have resulted in changes and improvements in the way the company operates. When a problem is found, and Pat Nazo can tell you this because he runs this program, when a problem is found, it is acknowledged and it is addressed. And these commitments are global commitments. They are commitments that employees can see, that business partners can see, and that customers can see. Now, these are just examples of the way in which a company can weave a sense of ethics and morality into its everyday life. Having said that, it is important to acknowledge that ethical standards are hard to achieve. Human beings are not perfect. Dilemmas present themselves regularly. What do you do with the strong performer who has a taste for the blandishments that a supplier is willing to provide? What do you do with the business opportunity that requires not inquiring into what makes a certain foreign business partner quite so successful? What do you do when the market is telling you it likes your competitor's business model and you consider that business model to be phony and don't want to embrace it? What do you do when a new employee brings with him information that can be used to the detriment of his former employer? The way in which a company struggles with and ultimately responds to such questions reflects and indeed creates the fabric of the enterprise, the ethical fabric of the enterprise. Now, training that explores difficult questions like these in an active way, in an interactive way, helps a great deal. Compensation systems and promotions that reward ethical behavior can work miracles. A CEO who talks about the company's values in multiple venues and multiple business contexts, that makes an impression. Exposing to employee scrutiny the company's weak spots emphasizes that it doesn't think it's perfect. When Schlumberger CEO Andrew Gould saw behavior he didn't like, he talked about it at employee forums to raise the consciousness across the company and around the world. He uses both positive and negative examples in everyday interactions with employees and the company's leadership. But what if these helpful characteristics are missing? How does a board know, and what should it do? In my view, the board has two roles. One is systemic, and the other is cultural. A board should not run a company. Its job is to ensure that the appropriate systems are in place and the appropriate people are in place. That is the systemic role. it also has a cultural role. It has to create within itself a culture in which the important questions are brought to the boardroom table and addressed in a forthright way. It needs to encourage that same forthrightness across the company. So let's focus first on the systemic. The systems that can be used are well known, though they're not always well executed. So let me address just two: the selection and compensation of the chief executive officer and the review of the company's compliance practices, because in my view, these are the two most important, although there are many others. The selection, the review, and the compensation of the CEO are among the board's most critical functions, especially in their impact on the ethical conduct of the company. Because, as I said at the outset, the CEO and his or her team set the tone for the company and can hugely affect the corporate culture. Employees will take note if the CEO welcomes contrary views, if the CEO cares about corporate values. As my partner Paul Brontis writes, the most important responsibility of the board is to hire, fire, and set the compensation of the CEO. Corporate responsibility begins with the CEO. The board's role is to monitor and supervise the company's culture and ensure that the CEO is sending the company's management team and employees the right message. So, the board needs to carefully consider and clearly articulate the goals for the CEO, and it needs to structure compensation so that it is aligned with the goals that it has articulated. For values to be a priority, they must be measured and they must be rewarded. Straight talk between the CEO and the board is critical, whether it is when the CEO meets with the board in full session or an executive session, or whether it is when the lead director or designated director relays the views of the board to the CEO on his performance and on his approach. Critical mid-course corrections on an array of issues can be made in this way. And if the board feels that the CEO is not properly communicating the values that the board wishes to see, this is a way to take immediate action to let him know. The Compensation Committee, of course, needs to operate independently. It'll often want the services of an independent compensation consultant. In any event, its decisions need to be fully informed and independent of management. Because these decisions are so central to the role of the board as a whole, the chair of the Compensation Committee has a special responsibility to keep all board members apprised of the committee's actions and its approaches. And this has to be the subject of discussion and consensus among the full board. Now, during periods of transition, and we see this in companies across America and the world, the board's role is even more important. Why is that? Because the board can ensure that core corporate values survive the end of one CEO's tenure and the beginning of another's. Powerful messages are sent in this selection process, in the anointing of an internal candidate or the selection of an external one. Employees, customers, and investors will take a message. They will take a message from the selection of a candidate with a strong moral and ethical compass, as they will from the selection of one who does not. The board, both through the Compensation Committee and as a committee of the whole, has to engage in this process. And this means discussing what do they want in a CEO. It means a discussion of the candidates and in structuring a transition process. Now, I said there were two structures that I wanted to discuss. The other one, of course, is the audit committee, because it is so critical to the ethical moorings of a company. Obviously, the ethics committee has to be the audit committee has to be fully engaged with the company's internal and external auditors, with its counsel, with its compliance personnel. If you've ever worked in a company, you know that the mere fact that a presentation is about to be made to an audit committee or to a committee of the board focuses the attention of management on potential problems. The regular reporting cycles for each of the reporting groups has to ensure regular board involvement in the checks and balances that permeate the corporate environment. But the reporting can have a mind-numbing quality. It can be difficult to parse unless the committee members have an appetite for it, understand the substance of what they're hearing, and ask good questions. Here, as with the Compensation Committee, the key is full and frank discussion. It is absolutely critical. While the oversight of internal auditors and external auditors has long been a function of the Audit Committee, though perhaps not in the detail and with the rigor that it is today, oversight of the compliance function is actually new to a lot of companies. Also, in the past, the focus of audit committees was on the individual problems that surfaced, for example, in an audit. But now the focus is more affirmative, and it is more in the way that Pat Nazzo described it to you. The focus is on ensuring that there is a robust audit and compliance program that protects the company and meets all of the legal and regulatory requirements. So the committee needs to ask if the compliance and audit systems actually define the risks that the company faces, and needs to direct audit and compliance attention to those risks. And those are the things that an audit committee needs to understand. The committee also needs to satisfy itself that information about problematic practices flows up to management and to the board, and that whistleblowers are protected from retaliation. The committee needs to know that the company has both a system for detecting illegal or unethical behavior and procedures whereby questionable conduct can be reported. It must feel comfortable that that code of conduct indeed represents the company's values. Now, I said at the outset that there were systemic roles and that there are cultural roles. These procedures don't in themselves guarantee or ensure ethical behavior. Compliance can be done by rote, or it can be done for real. The board needs to assure itself that the ethical training for employees is working. As I said, you can do this with surveys and through just informal contacts with employees. Another way to test the strength of an ethics program is to take a hard look at any wrongdoing that is uncovered and make sure that management has looked at the root causes and has done everything it can to prevent, protect, and punish improper conduct. On the two boards on which I sit, UTC and Schlumberger, I've been impressed with the unflinching response of management in the face of misfeasance. It is clear that these companies are committed to the tenets of their ethics programs, even when faced with the loss of a high performer, a superior performer, or a significant contract. Another test of the strength of an ethics program is whether it promotes and promulgates the same standards all around the world. If it does, as both of these companies do, that is evidence that the program itself is permanent and that it is indeed part of the corporate culture. Now, I've described two board functions, managing the relationship with the CEO and overseeing the compliance and audit activities of the company, that have changed substantially over the last decade. These two systemic elements are critical to the ethical tone of the company, but neither can be undertaken unless the board members themselves are comfortable speaking freely and frankly with each other. So let me address this issue of the quality of the board in the ethical equation. A strong board culture is absolutely critical to the ethical posture of a company. The members need to trust one another. They need a sense of a shared mission. Boards sometimes now use executive sessions, board retreats, and other mechanisms to build those relationships and develop a level of comfort in freely expressing views. The resulting cohesion permits disagreement that does not devolve into confrontation. In the absence of that kind of cohesion, a unity of purpose, if you will, within the board, disagreements are divisive rather than constructive. As a lawyer, I want to say a word about the special role that a lawyer can play in helping both management and the board in the challenging work of building and sustaining an ethical culture. Companies that integrate their lawyers, whether they're inside the company or outside the company, into the critical decision-making processes can benefit from the close working relationships that result. There's more likely to be an honest dialogue about legal, regulatory, policy, and ethical questions when there is that kind of integration. By contrast, if the lawyer is viewed as an obstacle, if the lawyer merely reviews plans after they're already set, if the lawyer is not viewed as a trusted counselor, he or she will not add nearly as much to the ethical ballast of the company. And it takes a confident manager and a confident lawyer to fill those roles, because both have to understand the lawyer's special obligations to raise issues until they are resolved appropriately. But companies that have lawyer-client relationships like these are more likely to prosper in a world that is filled with ethical minefields. Today more than ever, the stakes are high. Ethical values are not just nice to have. They are critical to the prosperity of a company. Just in the last year, a major merger was scuttled because in one corner of the company to be acquired, bribery was winked at. A well-regarded financial institution lost the right to do business in a major foreign market because its conduct was not thought to comport with local ethical standards. Huge fines are announced daily. Careers have cratered. Shareholder value has been lost. And yet on the other side of the ledger are those companies whose employees are motivated by being part of a well-regarded institution. Companies that have the cultural resilience to address problems with strength and with clarity. Companies whose customers and whose shareholders trust that they will be dealt with fairly. There is, in short, a great deal that board members can do to ensure that their companies are on the right side of that ledger. They need to embrace both the systemic and the cultural challenges. They need to ensure that the right systems are in place and that when management is tested, its instincts are right. They need to make sure that the company has the right leadership and that that leadership has the correct incentives. They need to make sure that the processes are in place to help all employees make ethical decisions. The board can also bring to bear a set of diverse perspectives and talents. Board members can be a sounding board for the CEO and senior management. Board members spend most of their time outside of that particular company, and they see and understand a larger landscape in which the company functions. So they can bring these perspectives to bear. They can, if you will, cross-pollinate with ideas from other businesses and other professional settings. They can counsel, they can prod management, they can encourage frank and unflinching discussions of hard questions. So let me answer in this way the question that I posed at the outset, which is whether the board is the keeper of the corporate conscience. The fact is that day in and day out, the ethical decisions and the fabric of the company's values are in the hands of the CEO and the company's management. But a board plays a critical role. While it does not sit on the company's shoulder, reminding it to do the right thing, it can help build and encourage and fortify the company's own conscience, mindful as it is of its responsibility to shareholders and to the other constituencies and communities that the company serves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have some good time for questions and answers, and it's open-ended, not only on her remarks this afternoon, but on whatever you would like to ask. Yes, can you wait just till we get a microphone up there to you so that we can capture the question?
Ms. Gorelick, which school did you attend?
Where did I go to school?
Yes.
I went to Harvard College and Harvard Law School, just down the road.
Ms. Gorelick, thank you. It's very impressive listening to what Schlumberger J and UTC does. I would like to ask you specifically, at a typical board meeting, how much time does the board address explicitly ethical issues, among many other things they have to take care of? And when they do, what proportion of that is of a negative sort, looking at lack of compliance, malfeasance, the kind of problems that ethical raises? And what proportion is a positive sort, looking at people who do very ethical things out of the ordinary that create the kind of spirit that you think is so important in these companies?
That's a great question. That is a really great question. Well, of necessity, we spend a great deal of time making sure that the systems are in place, that Pat Nazzo and his colleagues are doing their job, that we have great internal and external auditors, that the compliance function is working. We spend time listening to the complaints that emerge from that process and the elements that suggest that there might be some wrongdoing or some problem. And we look to see what management's response has been. And there's where positive feedback is often in order, because you can see how management behaves. If it is unflinching in dealing with a problem, if it is straightforward, if it is far-reaching, if it is willing to give up business benefits in the face of questionable or unethical activity, that gets good feedback and praise from the board. I would like to describe ethical values a little more broadly than that in responding to the part of your question that asked how much time do we spend on affirmative aspects, because there was a reason I gave the examples of our environmental health and safety program at UTC, or our investment in our employees above and beyond the call of duty, because I think that the language of ethics is spoken in that way, and it is spoken in the language that a George David might use when he will say, you know, we could get this contract if we did X, but I don't think that's the right thing to do, and we're not going there. Our competitor is doing that, we will not. And people see that, and they hear that. And this is not a company that brags a lot. It is a quintessentially New England company in its soft-spoken quality. But in its own way, it celebrates those values. It's hard for me to divide up the time. And honestly, I would have to say probably more of our time, and we spend a tremendous amount of time. If you're on the audit committee of a major company today, you are spending a lot of time. And I would say, if I had to, that probably 2/3 of it is on the, belts and suspenders and making sure we are doing everything we need to do. And perhaps 1/3 of it is the more affirmative and forward-looking. But that would be a sort of gross estimate. And were there ways to be more affirmative and be more positive, I'm sure we would embrace them.
Thank you. One of the things that you said is that the board of directors' role is systemic, and that one of their obligations is to put the right people in place. Now, in hiring the CEO, what qualities or values would you look for when you are interviewing, or whatever process that you go about? Because I know once a person is in place, it's a little difficult to remove them, and it's hard to identify what their actual values are, because they will say anything, maybe, at an interview.
Well, you're so right. And of course, it might be a little easier in the case of a CEO than it would be in the initial hiring process for someone you're bringing in laterally in a management responsibility in a company, because usually that person has a pretty long track record someplace. They've done a lot of things, and they know a lot of people, and a lot of people know them. And you know, people develop reputations, and they develop reputations because they can be observed in 1,000 ways. And that's why I said what I said about the code of ethics, that the code is a bunch of words. People know that you're an ethical person when they see you in private, making a decision that no one is going to call you on one way or the other, but they can see you've made the ethical choice. They know when they see how that person treats others, how they treat the lowest employee, how they think about the person's future or their education, how they worry about the environment that surrounds the company. Those are the things that essentially emanate from a leader, and you can actually measure it. And if you can't measure it any other way, in many companies you have 360 reviews where you ask everyone anonymously, and you know what? You get a lot of good information that way. Now, the problems come more frequently, I think, when someone is brought in from the outside and is less of a known quantity. There isn't the kind of honesty, quite frankly, when one is calling for references that one might like. And that is a problem. That is a real problem. It's a problem in university settings. It's a problem in any setting that you can think of. And that is why I think most companies would rather take the somewhat less sexy internal candidate who is a known quantity than the apparent star from outside. Judging people's character is an extraordinarily difficult thing. And therefore, if I were to give one piece of advice in that regard, it would be look to the concrete. What has the person done? And what do the people who are in a position to observe him or her say they have seen and felt and heard from that person?
Now, you have been talking about how management sets an example for employees, and the fact still remains that there are unethical companies out there, and as I understand it, the government can only do so much to enforce ethical laws, but a company has to be willing to be ethical in order to take this approach. Now, how can you ensure that unethical companies actually turn the corner and become ethical?
Well, there are lots of pressures right now on companies to do the right thing, even if they don't want to. Sarbanes-Oxley has put in any number of procedures for people to make complaints and make reports on a confidential basis. It's put an obligation on lawyers to, if they see anything that is problematic, to raise the issue up. It's changed the way in which boards are selected and the requirements of independence. The mere fact that there are so many lawsuits against board members has made board members kind of sit up and take notice when they're in the board meeting and ask harder questions and make sure that they understand precisely what their obligations are. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that all of these elements are likely to take out every element of ethical challenge in companies. But they're an improvement, I think. I know there have been lots of complaints across corporate America about how onerous these obligations are, but I actually think they're, by and large, very good and very healthy. I would say one other thing. In every community of 100,000 people, there are a couple of crooks. In every company of 100,000 people, there are going to be a couple of crooks. It is just human nature. So you cannot expect the perfect, but you can do what you can in the ways that I've outlined, and now tomes of ethics books and how-to and compliance programs and organizations like the one that Pat Nazzo leads in the defense industry, but across many industries, to improve the ethical tone. The fact is, let me ask a question here. How many of you have actually been in the working world before you were students or even while you're students? How many of you have been out there? Now, how many of you, this is a good number, this is good. This is not what you would get at Harvard College or Harvard Law School. You would not get this kind of experience, and this is good. How many of you have felt competitive pressures to do something that you weren't sure was the right thing. No, competition is tough. It's brutal. It's hard. And there are gray areas that are difficult. And we have shifting standards. So I don't want to stand here and tell you that these are all prescriptions for perfection. But I will tell you that I think the tone in the boardroom, the mood in corporate America, and the pressures from shareholders are having a good effect.
One of the things that you mentioned before was that the board of directors has a responsibility to ensure the safety of the environment. Now that could be the environment within the company itself or the community surrounding it. Where does ethics come into play when a company makes a decision? This also goes with the debate that's going on right now with the outsourcing. Being an election year, it's in the papers every day. Where does ethics come into play when a company makes a decision to bring its business elsewhere and start up a plant in a foreign country rather than keeping jobs here in the nation, when that's hindering and that's actually destructive to the environment that it does business in?
Well, that's a very good question, and it is one that is bedeviling us. One of the things I presume you learn here at Bentley is that competition is good. Competition also has some negative effects because competition will drive out the high-cost producer. And sometimes, if you keep high-cost labor, or if you put in place the highest level of environmental standards, you're the high-cost producer. So this produces a quandary, which, in my view, is best addressed by regulation. Now, that's not to say it's the only thing, but it is going to be very difficult for individual companies to say, I will not, for example, outsource and leave my costs higher than all of my competitors. And we talk about this, for example, in United Technologies. It pains us if we feel that we need to close a plant because the customer has moved abroad and we need to locate the production facility there, or because of the competitive environment. And that's why our countervailing big bet is on the education of our employees, because we know that that's the only real guarantee of employment. Now, the same is true for environmental standards. We have set for ourselves at United Technology, and Schlumberger has as well, higher environmental standards than the law requires. But that is very costly, and not everyone is going to do that. I had a conversation once with a very senior executive in the financial services industry. And, you know, the financial services industry has had these paroxysms of scandal every 5 to 10 years. And a cynical observer might say it's just the cost of doing business. I said, well, why not put in the kind of robust compliance program, say, that the defense industry has, so that you could prevent this? And the answer was, that would put us at a competitive disadvantage. And that's a reality, that sort of thinking is pervasive, and you have to be able to deal with it. And so when corporate America complains about regulation, in some ways the regulation levels the playing field and says everyone needs to meet this standard. So my short answer, and maybe it's because I'm a Democrat, is that in some places raw competition is not the answer. In some places you need to have a regulatory response. And on the issue of environment around the world, you need to have agreement internationally.
While other people are thinking of questions, I have one or two. I'll ask one now. You've mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley. Certainly there are new listing requirements on the exchanges, and there are even new amendments now to the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations before Congress. I wanted to ask two or three kind of specific questions with regard to the new regulatory environment and see how the board at UTC has responded to that, to some of these specifics. One of the things I'm interested in is how has the audit committee of the board responded to, well, I think it's section 302 or 304 of Sarbanes, where it's saying that the audit committee of the board now is responsible for overseeing an internal reporting system whereby employees can get concerns to the board directly. And I know some corporations have sort of tried to handle that by going through the ethics office. I wondered if UTC was in that same category, or have you, well, first, have you thought about it a lot at all and talked about it?
Well, we consider ourselves to be, quite modestly, the leader in corporate America on this, and I consider Pat Nazzo to be the leader. When I said earlier that we have had since 1992 a robust ombudsman system, we have had a system whereby employees and others, quite frankly, can come in either confidentially or not at their choosing and raise issues. And raise issues they have. The 60,000 inquiries is a huge number. Other companies that are just starting to have these processes are getting, 3 or 4 or a dozen. It is now in the fabric of the company. Now, 60,000 is a big number. A lot of people would say, gee, there must be a lot of problems in that company if it has 60,000 inquiries. A lot of them are concerns about between an employee and their immediate supervisor, or questions about their health care plan. But some of them raise real issues, and I think it is a terrific system because it lets the information flow. I mean, I quoted before the notion that a good CEO begs for the bad news. You really want to know what's going on underneath you. When I was Deputy Attorney General and I had over 100,000 employees and an $18 billion budget, I cultivated those sources outside my chain of command because I wanted to know what was going on underneath before it jumped up and nipped me. And I think it's a great idea.
Just to follow up very specifically, can an employee get a concern of his or hers to the board directly?
Yes, I mean, it goes through the ombudsman, but we get it. Mm-hmm. We don't get all 60,000 unfiltered, but we get it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the point I'm trying to make. It is filtered.
It's filtered only in the sense that it is, for example, we will get so many are employee disputes. Here are the ones you need to worry about. Here are the ones that raise serious issues, and they are actually described.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. This question may not be something that you know specifically at your level, but Pat may know. And that is for people who apply for jobs at United Technologies or Schlumberger, sending in a resume, are those resumes checked so that when you're bringing new employees into the company, you're checking to make sure that what's on that resume is accurate?
Yes, I believe so. In both companies, there's a process. Now, I haven't tested it myself, but I believe that to be the case.
Thank you.
I would worry if it were not the case.
And I think I stole a question from someone up there.
Hi, I have a question about diversity. I know there was a major study in Canada that suggested that boards that are diverse in terms of gender, background, ethnicity, in fact, tended to sort of be more ethical in the sense that they reviewed codes of ethics, they raised questions of management more so than in the past. And yet it seems that for most U.S. boards, especially the smaller ones, maybe not the Fortune 500, they have very few women or minorities. So I guess my question is, do you really think diversity encourages better business ethics on boards? And do you think that under Sarbanes and the more recent regulations that we'll see more women in diverse boards?
Yes and yes. I mean, I think that diversity, not just gender and race diversity, but diversity of points of view, is very helpful. And I think that is the trend, particularly since boards now have so much need for independent directors. you have less inbreeding just by the very nature of things. And I just returned from Fortune's conference of the most powerful women in business. And when you see how many women there are, for example, coming up in the ranks and reaching the senior ranks, and when you see how many are now on boards or moving onto boards, it's actually quite encouraging. I don't know the data that show that having more women or more minorities makes for a more ethical board, but I just think any time you get a broader, more robust conversation, you're going to have a better company.
Hi, Ms. Gorelick. I recently had to write a paper, and I had to find a newspaper article about something ethical that a company had done, and it took me an obscenely long time. I probably went through about 10 articles of the Wall Street Journal, and I was wondering...
Reading the wrong newspaper.
I know, but it just took me, as far as I'm concerned, too long, and I was wondering if you see this as a concern that the newspapers are focusing on the negative rather than the positive.
The answer to that is yes. I think corporate America does many, many terrific things that are not reported. And yet problems are headlines. And they're headlines from which companies sometimes never recover. And it doesn't suggest to young people that they should go into the corporate world. It doesn't suggest to them that they should be proud of their company's work, and I don't agree with that. And I think most people in the corporate world wouldn't agree with it either, and I think you would find them to be ethical and to do many things that are enormously helpful. So, you know, the fact that good news about companies isn't reported is really no surprise. Good news about anything isn't reported. I mean, there's a reason when you turn on your local news every night, the first 15 minutes is fires, you know, and car crashes and murders. It's not the good stuff. I don't know. That appears to be what people like to read about. Otherwise, I suppose they wouldn't print it that way, but it's just the case. And so one of the things that's nice, actually, is that there are awards now for various kinds of corporate responsibility efforts, for ethical behavior that highlight for people who are at least looking for an example, the many examples that are indeed out there.
Yes, I was glad to hear you speak about the role of the board in establishing a strong culture at the organization. And recently, there's been a number of articles in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Post, on your role as vice chair of Fannie Mae, specifically as it relates to the corporate culture. One of the issues, if I'm not mistaken, when you're talking about compensation, was that earnings were tied, or profits and bonuses were tied, I should say, to obtaining a certain earnings per share. And that's recently come under attack. And you can, if you'd like, you can read about these. The question I have is that in the report, they indicated that the board and management maintained a corporate culture that emphasized stable earnings at the expense of accurate financial disclosures, and there were more other quotes very similar to that within that document. The SEC is now looking into Fannie Mae and some of their reporting practices as well. What happened at Fannie Mae, and if there are going to be restatements which are necessary, will the bonuses that were paid out to the board over those years on earnings which may actually never have existed, will the ethical response be to return those bonuses, or what's going to happen with those?
Well, I don't know the answer to the last question, and I suppose it's well down the line. You know, I can't speak to the underlying facts other than what is currently in the public record, but what is in the public record is that there was a dispute over the proper accounting treatment of amortization, which the company says was appropriate under GAAP and which the regulator says was not. The company says their accounting treatment was supported by their outside auditor and has submitted it all to the SEC for its review, and I guess we'll just have to see what comes out of it. You know, I'm not going to comment other than to say to you a couple of things. One, the finance group was not in my chain, and so I'm really not able to elaborate on anything that you've read. Two, I always thought that the finance people at Fannie Mae were very ethical and were very highly skilled, and that's what I also heard from outside observers. Three, I never saw any pressure from the CEO or anyone to do anything that would affect the earnings per share results that was improper in any way. And four, tying compensation to earnings per share is routine in America. Now, maybe that's not the right thing to do, but it is the way in which most companies operate, and one of the factors that almost every board in America considers when it is both setting management compensation and also setting goals for management so that they are incented to do what is in the shareholder interest, which is to increase the earnings of the company.
What is your opinion of business ethics in fast food chains?
Business ethics in fast food chains.
You mean like McDonald's, the fat issues that are...
Well, I don't know. I'm the parent of a 16-year-old and 11-year-old, and if I never see another fast food restaurant, it'll be too soon. I don't have a view on the ethics of fast food chains. They do a pretty good job of getting my kids to go in there, despite my best intentions. I guess it's the American way. But this is a place where, it'd be an interesting study for you to look at what the pressures are on a company like that. What are the ways in which it makes money? And what are the legal constraints, and are there ethical constraints that they ought to be abiding by beyond their legal constraints? I think you've identified an industry where there's a lot of attention right now, and I think you pose an interesting question. I'm just sorry that other than as a consumer, I don't have much of an answer, or as an anti-consumer, I don't have much of an answer.
I have another question. I get to stick in one ever so often while you're thinking of others. This question also goes back to some of the new regulatory environment that we're in. And again, it goes back to Sarbanes-Oxley and how the SEC put certain of Sarbanes' principles into law, one of which, well, actually, I'll take that back. It really more comes from the New York Stock Exchange, which says that all boards that are trading on the NYSE should have a code of ethics. A lot of companies I know are adopting, that is, the board is sort of adopting the company code of ethics and sort of signing on to the company code of ethics. I wondered if at UTC there was a discussion in the board as to whether the board should have a separate code of ethics to accommodate that NYSE requirement, or whether just simply signing on to the company code of ethics would be sufficient.
I think most companies would say that it is important for the alignment of the board and the company to have the same code of ethics. And I don't know of a company that has two codes. The only element of board ethics that might differ from the rest of the company is what I was trying to describe in my opening remarks, where I was talking about the particular need for honest discussion at the boardroom table. I don't think you need to write that down. That is a pact among the individual members to be honest and frank and forthright with each other.
Any other questions? Okay. Yes.
Ms. Gorelick, could you please tell us how you came to be appointed to the 9/11 Commission, and also, since you've worn many hats in the government, any of the dilemmas that you encountered while you were on the Commission?
Oh, boy. We were 10, 5 Democrats and 5 Republicans, appointed by the most partisan people in Washington at one of the most partisan times in our government's history, and we are all partisans. So how is it that we came to operate in a bipartisan way? I actually think that despite the wonderful things that have been said about the substance of our hearings and the substance of the report, the biggest message to the American people has been that, yes, it is possible to work toward a common goal with a unity of purpose in a bipartisan way. And we have tried our best, frankly, to shame the rest of the government into doing the same thing. It hasn't always been easy. We were at this for 20 months. We were locked in a small room for hundreds of hours together. We worked through really difficult issues. We looked at the facts together. We interviewed witnesses together. We interviewed experts together. We debated questions together. We paired up to question witnesses. We argued over process. Do we subpoena the President of the United States? How important is it for all of us to see a certain set of intelligence materials? Is it possible for us to delegate to one or two of us? These were hard issues for 10 people who didn't know each other. So let me just quickly tell you how I think it came about and what I think the lessons are in that, and maybe then I can just spend a minute on the difficulties. One, we had great leadership. Tom Kean of New Jersey and Lee Hamilton of Indiana are fabulous leaders. Each of them were partisans in their own fashion, but they set out and promised each other that there would never be a partisan vote, and there never was. In fact, there were precious few votes. And as much as I admire Henry Kissinger and George Mitchell, who were the original chair and vice chair, who left almost immediately upon being faced with the ethics disclosures that were required, I don't think it would have been the same with two men who were by nature more partisan and would have sucked all the air out of the room. Tom Kean and Lee Hamilton listened abundantly and patiently and let each of us have our say. Very important. Number two, the families created enormous pressure on us to find the facts and behave ourselves and to be unrelenting in learning what happened and sharing that with the nation. Third, for most of us, this is our last big thing, and we wanted to do it right. And finally, we built up very strong personal relationships. When you argue with people for hundreds of hours, when you sit with them going over facts and in a mutual enterprise like that, there is a bonding that occurred. And I think that bonding was enhanced when I was personally attacked by the Attorney General in the course of one of the hearings. My fellow commissioners just rallied to me. They called themselves actually the Nine Brothers. It was sort of embarrassing. But we became more cohesive after that because, after all, it was an attack on the whole commission. I was just the very convenient object. This has been hard. There were partisan pressures on all of us. There were some people in my party who would have liked to have made a partisan issue. They would have liked nothing better than to have subpoena after subpoena on the President of the United States. There were people on the other side who wanted to pressure us not to have Condoleezza Rice testify, not to have the President and the Vice President testify. And we developed our own set of values and what we wanted to do. And I think it came out in the right place. But thank you for that question. Thank you.
Other questions? Yes, Bye.
A company of your size, you invest in a series of countries all over the world. And business ethics is a very gray field in a lot of these countries. So how does a company in the board level decide, judge on the human rights record of a political party in power? Like, let's suppose what happened with Shell Corporation in Nigeria. How does a company of your size take those factors into account?
Well, both United Technologies and Schlumberger operate in many parts of the world. And for Schlumberger in particular, being in the oil and gas services business, it operates in some difficult parts of the world. And you have to make judgments about whether your presence is a help or a hindrance, whether your presence is a danger to your employees. In general, the attitude of U.S.-based multinational companies is that commerce is good, industry is good, and for the countries in which the companies invest. There are circumstances from time to time when you are confronted with a corrupt regime, when you're confronted with a brutal regime, where you simply make the decision that this is not the place for our company to make its bet. And countries that have threatening, corrupt leadership do harm to their people in many ways, and that's one of them.
I'm going to take the liberty of asking one last question,
All right.
if I may. And I should probably, before I do, just mention that this lecture is also co-sponsored by the Alliance for Ethics and Corporate Responsibility here at Bentley, and also the Institute for Women in Leadership. The new amendments to the federal sentencing guidelines for organizations also, well, if they go into effect, which they're supposed to on November 1st, they're before Congress now, requires with quotes around it, but certainly strongly suggests as now a new part of the guidelines that boards of directors have ethics and compliance training. And I think this is a whole new kind of dimension for ethics officers, for the field of business ethics, and probably to some extent for boards of directors themselves. I wondered if UTC's board has started thinking about the board having ethics and compliance training, and if so, what have you been thinking along those lines? And even if you haven't been thinking about it yet, do you have some thoughts about it?
Forward-thinking and forward-leaning boards have already, if you will, taken on board the notion of having training of all sorts, including ethics training. Most of it, Dr. Hoffman, is done through outsiders, either who come into the board or where we go to a course or a university for training. I find it to be very useful. You step out of your role, you have somebody who is very well educated, very thoughtful, who prods you on what you should be doing, what you should be thinking, the questions you should be asking. And you come into the boardroom the next time renewed and with a broader perspective. I think it's terrific. Now, it adds time. Just like the audit committee obligations have doubled, this adds time. But, and as a consequence, most people on boards are taking fewer board obligations. But I think it is the right thing to do, and I think it is very helpful, sentencing guidelines or not. I think it's a good best practice, and I frankly think that is the course we're on without regard to the sentencing guidelines. Shareholders groups are asking about it, and programs are proliferating, and the feedback has been good, so I think if you're offering these courses, it's probably a good thing.
Jamie Gorelick, thank you so much for coming.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Excellent questions. Thank you. Thank you.